the seismic disturbances from fracking in an area local to that, what are the risks of that, increased risks of perhaps that layer of rock collapsing, and if there is contaminated water in that void, the actual the coastline becoming contaminated by chemicals that were left in there when they escape.
I think you make some very good points there. On radon, I know this is something that the regulatory authorities have not taken into account at all. And I read a description of an account by a radon specialist who had grave concerns over radon in association with unconventional gas extraction. The seismicity I didn't really touch on, but this idea of fracking causing tremors isn't insignificant. The companies would have you think that that these tremors are so minor they're inconsequential. And in terms of the damage they can cause on the surface, I expect that there's actually very minor consequences. But what they don't say is that if you have seismicity of a nature that can damage the well casing, then that is potentially very significant indeed, because then you can have this contamination of groundwater. So it's that aspect of the seismicity which is the most concern for me.
One more question.
Well, you say, my name's Alan Roberts, I just live locally, and I've always seen my area really messed up. To me, it's just capital. But if we talk about the fracking, especially down in Landell, those cliffs along there are fragile. We've already had one slip. What are the risks of further slips on those cliffs? How do they set off their charges?
I suppose it depends how far inland, but the thing with the fracking is that each well will have at least 6 or maybe 12 different directions that it's going off in. And again, all we have here is the integrity of the companies who are in this business to tell us that everything's fine. And they have very well-oiled communication and publicity departments who are paid specifically to do just that. And as the lady said over there, we have a long history in South Wales of environmental pollution, as a result of fossil fuels. And the last thing I want to do is to see Wales yet again being taken for a ride by fossil fuels, which actually we can do without. We can just do nothing.
Can I stop you there? Right. Because Gareth has got another appointment at 9 o'clock, so he's got to go. But I'm sure we all enjoy that time. It's a pity we couldn't do more.
Yeah.
Thanks very much. Right, well, if I may now introduce Suzy Davies, our regional conservative, I think I should say that, who I'm sure, well, I'm intrigued to see where you stand vis-a-vis Tory Party nationally on fracking.
Okay, thank you very much. Well, diolch yn fawr pawb hefyd, a diolch yn gwahoddiad Margaret. I think my function at this meeting is different from Gareth, who's explained to you about the science and some of the arguments the Friends of the Earth are doing. But I think my role is mainly to give you some sort of flavour of the kind of considerations that politicians of all colours are taking into account at the moment. Because, as Gareth said, fracking in particular, but unusual shale gas extraction more generally, is something that's only now that perhaps the population at large is starting to take an interest in, even though the actual political interest in it has been going on for some time. Gareth referred to the fact that there'll be some new licences out for sale pretty soon, but of course the existing licences were introduced and sold under the last government, so it isn't just a straightforward case of one party going for one thing and one party going for another idea. The situation is more fluid and perhaps surprising in some cases. Now, I'm an Assembly member, I'm not a Member of Parliament, I'm not even our environmental spokesman, but as a local Assembly member, I'm more than happy to perhaps give you a brief idea of where the Conservative, or I should say the coalition government really, but the Conservative element of that lies in London. And while I perhaps would contest what Gareth said about an unseemly frenzy, I think it's probably fair to say that the Prime Minister has an enthusiasm for shale gas extraction, which is not necessarily shared by the Welsh Conservatives in the Assembly, and I'll come on to that in a little while. Now, the general principle behind the coalition government's position on this is that while it remains concerned, sincerely concerned about climate change, it has to juggle a number of different political priorities, policy priorities. And one of those, of course, is fuel poverty. And you will hear more than one party talking about the difficulties that Wales in particular faces with fuel poverty. And when the shale gas deposits were discovered, and they've only been examined in 11 counties, if I understand this correctly, and that in itself has resulted in, I can't quite remember the figure, but I think it's like 1,300 trillion cubic feet of shale gas being available in those 11 counties, just a tenth of which would keep the UK going for, I think it's 10 years in terms of fuel stability. You can understand why a government of any colour can't just ignore suggestions like that, simply because it has a commitment to climate change. I mean, there are lots of different priorities that need to be juggled. So I think that's possibly where the coalition government has started. Now, into their argument, they're also featuring things like it'll produce jobs and that the money produced will be of a benefit to the community. But I think the central piece of information that's important in this meeting is that the Prime Minister thinks, or at the moment thinks, that this technology is safe. And this is where the Welsh Conservatives in the Assembly have a slightly more precautionary take on this. But even having said that, I think the Prime Minister is very conscious of the fact that just because he is persuaded it's safe doesn't necessarily mean that everyone has to take its word for that. And he, I'm afraid Gareth was wrong in one respect. There is a difference between Welsh, what's happening in Wales and what's happening in England regarding changes in planning. Because part of the way that the government in the UK is trying to persuade audiences like this, perhaps, that fracking and other shale extraction is an acceptable idea, is to hone in on the argument of safety. And he is putting that burden on companies who are interested in developing any kind of gas extraction, but through the planning system. And something that is definitely happening in England and doesn't seem to be on the horizon in Wales is that there will be changes in planning guidance, and there will be changes in planning guidance that are specific to shale gas extraction. And they're not necessarily going to have the easy time that Friends of the Earth seem to think might be happening, because part of that planning guidance is not out yet, I have to say that, but part of the thinking behind that is that you have to balance the other priorities that local authorities have to consider when they're facing planning applications. And I'll mention that a little bit in a minute when I'm talking about Wales. The other advantage that they have in England that we don't have in Wales is something called the Localism Act. Some of you may be familiar with that. But this is a statute that doesn't apply in Wales, but gives, in the course of planning applications, a much greater weight to the voice of local objectors. So, for example, and I think of many grounds for objecting to all these sorts of applications, it does mean that if you're in a locality, what you have to say does carry greater weight. Now, I suppose it's also important to mention that the sort of whole licensing process is actually something that's a matter for the UK government. It's not devolved. But one of the things that we can do in Wales is use our planning system to look at this whole issue of gas extraction differently. And certainly this is a view that my group in the Assembly takes, and where we differ from the position that the UK government is taking. Because while we too accept that you can't undiscover things like the deposits of shale gas, there are important ways that we can deal with it that aren't to our detriment, both in terms of climate change, but also in terms of safety and community reassurance about what any form of gas extraction can mean. So just to start off with the coal bed methane, which I think was the second of Gareth's slides, I'll start with that one because I think as a group we're slightly more relaxed about that. It's something that's already been happening, and in fact during the days of coal mining, actually these shafts were being sunk anyway for the safety of miners. And I think the view we come to on that is that we would rather burn methane and produce carbon dioxide than let methane come into the atmosphere, because it's a more violent greenhouse gas. I think that's probably the summary of that. But in terms of coal gasification and fracking, we are far more cautious. We are concerned about the safety arguments and the fact that while, of course, there are mitigation and prevention methodologies and technologies out there, those haven't been tried in Wales particularly. And as a Welsh Conservative group, we think as a new industrial technology for Wales, and with untested prevention and mitigation measures, we ought to take things a lot more slowly, and we are miles away from an unseemly frenzy on it from our perspective. In terms of planning, which is something, of course, that we can deal with fracking applications and other applications in Wales, we're a bit disappointed on the situation so far. To be fair, Gareth has alluded to some of this already. But the Barry Glamorgan decision, I'm sure many, are you all broadly familiar with that in the room? Where the local authority said that they didn't want some exploratory fracking work to take place because they didn't feel confident that their planning guidance said it was a good idea. And that was actually overturned by the Welsh Government Planning Inspectorate. What concerns me about that is the first point, which is, well, one local authority has already said it's not very confident on existing planning guidance. But the second thing is that we've now got potentially a precedent set by the Welsh Government that gives you sort of, implies that these applications should be treated favourably. And my inner lawyer is really worried about that, particularly in the Bridgend area. I think you mentioned it, didn't you, Laurie? Sorry, I missed your name. The Merthyr situation. I think, I mean, this situation is not going to go away. It's going to be very difficult for any government to turn around and say, no, we're not touching this.